This is an issue that all Canadians need to start to pay attention to, not just Canadian Sikhs. We have to remember that the Indian government is targeting democratic institutions here in Canada. They've interfered in our past two elections. They interfered in the previous Conservative Party leadership campaign. And I think one of the things that people need to understand, even about that testimony, is that unless Canadian Sikhs, unless the World Sikh Organization, along with some partners, had petitioned the foreign interference inquiry to include India, we would not even be talking about this at the commission and the inquiry. The Conservatives had blocked having India added as one of the nations that is engaged in foreign interference. And again, all of things that would offend Canadian Sikhs, we understand the impact and the extent of what India is doing. We saw the assassination of Shahid Hardeep Singh Nijjar in BC, but the revelations of this week demonstrate a much larger effort and clandestine efforts for the Indian government to surveil, to extort, to undertake through proxies campaigns of violence in this country, attempts to destabilize our country, attempts to show that Justin Trudeau is incompetent when it comes to clamping down on criminal activities. And I think finally Trudeau has had enough of the Indian government's attempts to interfere, and it's finally taking a strong stand. And I think the Canadian Sikh community has welcomed this opportunity for him to show some leadership. After last year, after he stood up in Parliament and had announced that there was credible intelligence to support that the Indian government was behind the assassination of a Canadian citizen, Trudeau has been particularly silent. He's let the RCMP do their work, gather their evidence, and be able to make a case against people who were working in the Indian High Commission. And what you've seen over the last few years is that the Indian High Commissioner has gone on tours of this country. They've gone to try to placate Canadian institutions. Sanjay Verma, who has been named in a lot of the conversations around Indian interference, was here in Alberta not too many months ago, meeting with NATE, meeting with the University of Alberta, meeting with politicians, getting welcomed at the legislature by Minister Rajan Sawhney, who should understand and who should know better when the community was telling her that Sanjay Verma has a direct link in what the violence that is happening with Canadian Sikhs. But they ignored a lot of those things, and a lot of politicians and a lot of people in this country have ignored the warnings that come from community and of people, because people need to understand the Canadian Sikh community has been under surveillance by the Indian state for the past 40 years. This is the 40th anniversary of the Sikh genocide in India. We are particularly vulnerable right now as a community as we remember the genocide of what happened and what happened in November of 1984. And for us, the vindication that comes with these revelations supports everything we've been saying for so long. And for the Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre has absolutely failed to step up at this moment. He couldn't even put out a statement through his own accounts when the RCMP does its press conference. This is not political. It's not political posturing. The RCMP is not doing their press conference at the direction of Justin Trudeau. They're not an instrument of the Liberal Party. They're not an instrument of the political process. And so for Pierre Poilievre to now, 2 days later, say, well, name these people when he knows Trudeau cannot, it's absolute politics. The community will not stand for it. We're absolutely upset that the Conservatives continue to ignore the attempts of the Indian government to interfere in our democratic institutions.
It's got a lot of people wondering, will this Pierre Poilievre compromised? It's a tough look for him, isn't it?
Well, when we know that the Indian government interfered in the Canadian, in the Conservatives' past leadership, there's strong allegations that exist. When it comes to that leadership campaign, targeting of a potential opponent of Pierre Poilievre's, Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown, and so I think there's a lot of questions. I think there's a lot of questions when it comes to certain MPs that he has that have a track record of anti-Sikh statements, a track record of supporting the Indian government. Harper and Associates is well known to be paid by Indian companies for lobbying in this country. And whether or not that gets put under scrutiny, I think that's a big question that needs to be answered. But absolutely, you have a state that is not only is it targeting the Sikh community through surveillance, through we saw a spate of extortions, arsons, killings, violence that has been taking place that now is traced directly to the government of India. And at the highest levels. We've seen the Washington Post report that some of this direction came from Amit Shah, who is basically Narendra Modi's right hand. He's the president of the BJP. It's extremely troubling. The U.S. just yesterday unsealed, the DOJ unsealed a new superseding indictment when it came to an actual Government of India employee, somebody who worked in the cabinet secretariat. He was the one who directed Nikhil Gupta to go and hire a hitman to kill a prominent Sikh activist in the U.S. And so the more evidence that continues to come out about India's activities across the globe targeting the Sikh diaspora, but it's not only that. Social media, you can see India is operating a bot army that is now aligned with the far right to attack immigrants. And we can see the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment in this country. A year ago, Canadians still majority thought that immigrants were an economic benefit to this country and they welcomed immigration. And now a year later, we see this total anti-immigrant movement. People are turned against immigration in a broad way. And that benefits Pierre Poilievre. He's the direct beneficiary of so much of the activity of what the Indian government has been sponsoring and what they've been complicit in.
Like, sorry, Harman, I'm really naive when it comes to all of this, so thank you for always sharing with us. But can you explain maybe simply the ethnic politics in terms of, so our Liberals and Sikhs, Conservatives and the other side, like why won't the Conservatives say anything? Like, are they activating groups to support them get votes out and win? Like, the politics and the voting behind it? Because I don't understand why they won't get involved. Like, what are the politics?
You know, I would expect that Conservatives would always stand up for the integrity and the sovereignty of our country, and stand up against countries that are interfering. I think like I said, Pierre Poilievre is the direct beneficiary of so much of India's clandestine efforts. The work they're doing on social media to attack Justin Trudeau, to attack him as showing him as a weak leader, of somebody who cannot keep his own citizens safe, that is allowing for extremists in this country to create an unsafe environment. They try to pin all of these extortions and arsons that you saw over the last year across this country on Justin Trudeau's incompetence. You know, and who is the one? Who does that benefit? It benefits Pierre Poilievre, who wants to be seen as being tough on crime, on somebody who's going to be tough on these types of issues. And so for him, they're doing his work for him. There's a direct benefit that the Conservatives are receiving, and yet for them to now capitulate, to absolutely abandon a vulnerable community when we're being, the targets of assassination campaigns is pathetic. You know, for Pierre Poilievre not to issue a statement from his own account about the RCMP's revelations about how, again, we expelled 6 people from the High Commission because they were engaged in espionage, engaged in surveillance, engaged in direct activities to attack our democratic institutions and to attack Canadian citizens. Like, this is absolutely like bombshell stuff.
If it was another nation like Russia, like we'd have I think there'd be a completely different reaction to this if this, the politics are definitely something that interests me.
Why do you think it would be so different if it was Russia?
I just think I don't know, and I want Harman to answer. I think it'd be a bigger news story. I think parties would take it more seriously. I think it's taken forever for this to be even taken seriously. And if it was Russia, this would have been way bigger of an issue. Doing this, killing people on our soil. Like, think about it. Just put it on Russia.
Yeah.
Say all the same things, and the reaction would have been completely different. And what do you think the answer is, Harman?
Let's be blunt. When the target of India's campaign are, people with long beards and turbans, it's hard for many people to feel empathy or to feel sympathetic to that, because in their minds, till this date, when they see someone with a big long beard and a turban, they think terrorist. And it's so easy for them to connect what Indian government plays in on is these are the extremists, these are the terrorists. Of course, these guys must be wrong. There must be something more here. And how many times, even in this city, when I would tell people and go to them and tell them that, look, this is what the Indian government has done. There is demonstrated evidence that this is what the Indian government says. They will always say, well, no, this is some other kind of ethnic, tribal, dispute. This has nothing to do with Canadian institutions. Again, and this is why my message is, this is something that all Canadians need to be paying attention to. India was not even going to be a target of the inquiry and the commission unless we petitioned and were granted that approval to have India be part of this. Trudeau's testimony 2 days ago is just about, what comes out of it is just about the government of India. That doesn't happen unless we do the work. For all those other nations, when it comes to Russia, China, Iran, that there was no doubt, there was no question people had. And part of it is because India, kind of portrays itself as the world's largest democracy. And the difference between Russia and China and Iran on that, makes it very difficult for them to understand why a democratic nation would engage in these types of activities. And what they don't understand is that India's slide into fascism, India's slide away, and the hyper Hindu nationalism that has overtaken that country has changed what that country looks like. But this has been a struggle for the Sikhs for a long time. And why do they target us? Because the Sikh community is the largest faith group without its own separate nation. The Sikh community had its own nation before 1849, prior to colonialism, and then 1947, when India was formed and Pakistan was formed, who suffered? It was the Punjabi Sikhs who suffered during partition. So the movement for Khalistan, the movement for separatism, is a completely normal movement. You wouldn't treat Quebec separatists the way that the Indian government treats Khalistanis, but we are a massive threat to their nation in the sense of they want to maintain control over the billion people that live there. And the Sikhs have always agitated for greater sovereignty, greater federalism, and for independence. And again, I think it's been really convenient for a lot of Canadians to dismiss the evidence against India because that Sikhs are bearded, turbaned men. And we had media personalities in this country who for years exercised their own vendettas against the Sikhs and helped to be agents, provocateurs of the Indian government. The Terry Moleskis of the world. You look at other mainstream journalists, the Terry Glavins, Kim Bolans, they're problematic reporting. When the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar happens, the Sikh community steps up and says, this is the Indian government. Kim Bolan and Terry Glavin say, absolutely not. This is their own internal ethnic warfare. What happens? Months later, Trudeau confirms that it's the Indian government. We feel vindication. Where's the apology from those mainstream media outlets? Nowhere. And so the Indian media, starting from the Trudeau trip, when Trudeau goes to India, how many mainstream outlets said, oh, this is a disaster? And they would simply pick up narratives from the Indian state that they were filtering through their media, and they would just regurgitate them with no understanding of what was happening. Zero understanding. Not reaching out to Canadian Sikhs, not asking us, what is this about? But using that opportunity to undermine Trudeau. And that's what Pierre Poilievre did.
Jillian in the chat just says, damn, Harman bringing the facts. I don't know if you remember, it was September, I know you'll remember, but the date, it was September 19th. Can we load up this TikTok, Johnny, that you put together? September 19th of last year. Harman, you were on the show and we were talking about the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, and we turned it into a 60-second clip, and I want to talk about what happened with it, because well over 500,000 views, and it obviously spread. But here's the point: is you were telling us your mom didn't even want you coming on the show. This is what Harman said on September 19th of last year on Real Talk.
Hardeep Singh Nijjar was warned by Canadian intelligence that he was going to be a target. And he's not the only one. There's many others on that list who have been warned by Canadian intelligence that you're on a list, that your life is in danger. For those others who've been warned, we want them to have security. We want the Canadian intelligence to actually ensure the safety of Canadians. Even today, talking about this, when I left the house this morning, my mother told me not to.
Really?
Absolutely. She asked me where I was going. I said, I'm going to do an interview about what the Prime Minister said. She said, don't do it. I don't want you to do it. She knows the consequences that we face for speaking out.
So why did you disobey your mom and show up here today?
When Hardeep Singh Nijjar knew that he was going to be killed by the Indian government, he continued to speak out. The day he was assassinated, he talked about it from stage, that no matter what happens, a Sikh will always speak out against oppression. We will always stand up for human rights. That is our duty. That is our obligation. That is our responsibility.
So, that's been watched more than 500,000 times. It's been liked 11,000 times. It's been shared 1,200 times. I don't know if your mom would love that, because the message sure spread further than maybe we even thought it might. But did you feel somewhat vindicated over the developments over this past week or so?
Yeah, I think the vindication is clear for the Canadian Sikh community. For decades, for years, not being believed. It sounds like conspiracy theorists when you say that there's agents operating in our communities on the behest of the Indian Indian government, that the embassy employs security personnel in the guise of consular officials, that the Indian state, understand, the Indian state uses visa approvals to have ordinary citizens spy on other Canadians. They've paid ordinary citizens in Canada to spy on other Canadian citizens. This is something that I heard of when I was a child in the 80s and 90s. People would talk about in community, and I dismissed it as a Canadian-born Sikh. Thought it was conspiracy. But as we went further into this work, as we went through and investigating these issues, you realize the truth of it. So after 40 years of facing this, to finally have the recognition from government, from the RCMP, from police, from our prime minister, is absolute vindication for the Sikh community. But there's so much more that needs to be done.
I appreciate you bringing this. The live chat just came alive in the last 10 minutes, and I appreciate your insights into this. Gabe just says you're a very brave person, Harman. Do you ever hesitate to speak out like this?
I think, going back to what I said all those months ago, when we see someone like Shaheed by Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who, knowing the threat to his life, willing to still continue to speak out against the Indian government, knowing and willing to speak out against oppression, willing to stand up for human rights, it inspires a generation of Canadian Sikhs to continue to do that work. I think Sikhs draw their strength from their faith. They draw strength from, understanding that it's our duty to speak out and stand up against oppression wherever we see it, whether that's in this country, whether that's in India. And so for all of us as Sikhs, it's something that's part of our duty, and we look at it as part of that responsibility and obligation.